Welcome back. So, as we build towards developing an understanding of what ethnic studies is, our frameworks in ethnic studies, the direction of the discipline, I want us to hold a question. How was the discipline of ethnic studies established in the academy? This is a particularly important question because, unlike other disciplines, ethnic studies started very much because of students, much like yourself, right? It was not a discipline that always already existed. It was not a discipline that the bureaucracy thought we should have. It was a discipline that was conceived of and fought for by students. So we're starting with this question. How did ethnic studies become something that you can now take as college courses? It can be easy to look at a course catalog today and assume that the academic discipline simply developed because scholars identified something worth studying. For ethnic studies and the particular history of ethnic studies, it is out of a social justice movement and out of a fight. Students and communities demanded that colleges and universities change not only what they taught, but who had access to higher education, who taught within those institutions, and whose knowledge would be recognized. So before we talk about ethnic studies as an academic discipline, we have to understand it as part of a larger political movement, right? So what this means is putting ourselves within the political landscapes of the 1950s, 60s, and the 70s. When we move through the next few slides, I'm going to talk to you about the historical development of the field and the social milieu that the field develops within the context of. So thinking about the historical background of ethnic studies, the field emerges in the late 1960s, early 1970s, but its legacy is in the 1950s and 1960s. Young people and college students were central to many of the movements of that period of time. If you think about the civil rights movement, for example, it depended heavily on the energy, organizing efforts, and activism of young people, college-age students, high school-age students. And ethnic studies is part of that student-led, student-initiated social movement. We see in the 1960s a shift in the political discourse of the time. We see a shift from the tactical legal actions of the civil rights movement to a demand for something more tangible, right? They wanted to see physical changes. You can think of this in terms of de facto and de jure. De facto are the things that happen in reality, in fact. De jure are the things that happen in the law. So the civil rights movement got a lot of wins in the courtroom, right? So there were a lot of legal battles and there were a lot of wins. Just because those successes happen in the court does not mean that they became manifest in everyday practices. And towards the 1960s, the students who had been active for all of those years, who had been a part of those movements, had been a part of those discussions and those legacies, who had put their bodies on the line, were getting frustrated at the fact that though the civil rights movement saw important legal wins, they were not seeing the actual practices. So when we talk about something in fact, we're talking about, with regard to this, we're talking about what is actually being practiced. So it was illegal to have segregation in school, but in practice, the last school to desegregate was in, I think, 2015 or 2016 in Mississippi. So just because something is illegal does not mean that it actually is being enforced in the law. So that's an important distinction. So as they're moving from the civil rights legal strategies and tactics, the sit-ins, the marches and that kind of thing, they start moving and putting a greater emphasis on self-determination, liberation, racial pride, and community power. At the same time, we're seeing different groups The Chicano and farm workers movements were organized around labor, political representation, education, and community self-determination. We're going to see that self-determination over and over again. Cesar Chavez, and yes, I am aware of the allegations and the charges against him. In the context of talking about the farm workers movement, his name is still central to the movement. The actions of the movement, though, the negotiating power actually rested in Dolores Huerta, and I heralded her long before those claims came out about Cesar Chavez. Huerta helped organize what became the United Farm Workers, while Chicano student activism was also expanded on college campuses. We're seeing the free speech movement. We're seeing organizing efforts around the different racial, ethnic groups. Off campus, we're seeing the Watts Uprising of 1965. We're seeing students and more people in opposition to the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. We see the emergence of organizations like the Black Panther Party and the Young Lords. We're seeing women's liberation movements take different tracks and trajectories. We're seeing the LGBTQ plus movement. And all of these movements and organizations were challenging existing institutions and ideas about whose experiences and whose voices matter, right? So the landscape of higher education is changing. Something else happens in the West, particularly in California. We see a movement, a population boom where California itself changes in its population. The rapid growth of California in the 60s and the 70s included populations from historically marginalized communities. So that meant that access to higher education in the West and in California's institutions also become more diverse because the population of the state is more diverse. As these students are on campus in what is considered PWIs or predominantly white institutions, they're recognizing that there's some limitation in the materials that they're receiving. Students understand that there's importance of perspective and representation. So the struggle for culturally relevant education wasn't simply about seeing themselves in textbooks or adding a new book to a class. They wanted an education that connected to and addressed their experiences while also challenging institutional and structural power writ large. And remember the larger environment when we have those different organizations, those different movements, that growth in California, the free speech movement, the Watts Uprising, and those kinds of things. Students aren't creating ethnic studies in isolation. They're creating it within an environment charged with questions about these things, questions about representation, social justice, liberation, and power. And these struggles were not only occurring outside of the university itself became a site of that struggle. These struggles began to develop within a global context, and we're seeing movements of people of color and marginalized people across the globe who are also engaging in struggles for their liberations, their rights of recognition, representation, and their humanity. Students were increasingly asking what the social movements happening around them meant to their own education, not just in California, not just in the United States, but globally. Then later we have events such as the killings on Kent State in 1970 by police officers that had been called in, the shootings at Southern University in 1972, also demonstrated the extent to which student activism could be met with a really terrible institutional and state violence and resistance. So ethnic studies did not simply appear because universities suddenly decided that, we need greater representation, we need greater cultural response. These are good ideas. It emerged, and this is really important, it emerged from an era of organized struggle over power, access, representation, knowledge, self-determination, and liberation. So what were students challenging? these 6 key points on the screen are the basic things that students were challenging within the institution or within the universities themselves. Students began looking at their institutions and asking, if we are challenging racial inequality throughout U.S. society, what about the inequality that's being produced and reproduced here on the campus? Many students of color face barriers to entering higher education in the first place. It was already hard to get into PWIs. Once admitted, they entered institutions in which faculty remained overwhelmingly white and curricula overwhelmingly reflected European and Euro-American histories, theories, and intellectual traditions. That created an important distinction for understanding the origins of ethnic studies. Students weren't simply saying, let's add a book. And I'm sure that you have been in a class where the class is considered culturally relevant or culturally responsive because they have a person of color. Usually it's a person of color author added to the syllabus. And they are being very, very left-minded. You might have a queer person or something like that as part of, you might have a person of the LGBTQ plus community or something like that as part of the curriculum. But adding a simple text to a relatively homogeneous curriculum does not make it culturally responsive. Having things like Black studies, Chicano studies, sign language, those kinds of things as electives, as a part of something that we should be learning as core to our education, our ability to relate to one another, also doesn't make for a liberal, culturally responsive institution, right? Those are things that I want you to think about. They are questions about how the university determines what counted as knowledge in the first place, right? And a lot of students, particularly when ethnic studies first began to be mandated, and I still hear some of this feedback, students feel that ethnic studies is not something that they should have to take, that these kinds of classes, and they often say classes like this just teach racism and that kind of thing. And that's not accurate. We're not teaching racism. We're teaching you to read society. And if you understand that as racist, the way society is structured as racist, then that's what you're seeing. Like, that's the reality of what you're seeing. What I have always found interesting, though, is the resentment that students sometimes feel about taking these classes and saying that they should be electives, because they shouldn't be made to take classes when all of your education for all of your life has been classes that you've been made to take, have been determined for you. The institution determines that you need 4 English courses, that you need 4 math courses, that you need 3 science courses. They determine those kinds of things for you already. And what's interesting is, because that has been normalized in our society, we accept that without question, no matter what field you're going into. But when we're thinking about a class like ethnic studies or Black studies, Chicano studies, Asian American studies, Indigenous studies, when we're thinking about a class like that, and you see that as an elective, even though you exist in a society where you have to engage with diverse people all the time, that's rather telling. And so I want you to think about that. I want you to think about what is constituted as real, effective, valuable knowledge. They're terms that I will come to a number of times. Epistemology, which is the study of knowledge, axiology, which is how we value these things, and ontology, which is the theory of being. When you think about what is considered optional knowledge and what is considered necessary knowledge, your English class that has Shakespeare as a necessary knowledge, your European history class as a necessary knowledge and not an elective, but learning about the experiences of people in the country where you live are optional knowledge. That's rather telling. I want you to pay attention to that. So it determines, so epistemology says, what kinds of things are we considering to be valid knowledge? These are actual sources and sites of knowledge. Axiology says what kind of valuation we put on those things. And ontology asks you to think about beingness, right? Who gets to be centered, a part of the discussion, and who gets erased at the same time. So students were asking, where were the histories of Black folks and Indigenous folks? Where were Asian Americans and Chicano or Latinx folks or Chicanx folks? Where were their languages, literature, philosophies, their knowledge, their cultural practices, their political movements, their community knowledge? Where were those things in these institutions? And when these communities did appear in traditional curriculum, how were they represented? Who was interpreting their experience? Was it from their voices? This is where the struggle becomes a struggle over institutional and structural power. Universities have power. They determine what courses exist, who teaches them, what scholarship is considered legitimate, what students are expected to know, and whose knowledge receives institutional recognition. Student activists understood the importance then of perspective and representation, but their demands went beyond just simple representation. They wanted a culturally relevant education that could challenge and transform institutional and structural power. That's why the demands you'll see when we get to the Third World Liberation Front don't just include courses. They include departments, faculty, admissions, resources, and institutional authority. We'll get to the demands in just a minute. But the questions that existed underneath those specific demands was, who gets access to higher education? This question is about who gets to enter the institution and who historically has been excluded from them. But getting through the door isn't enough. It's also asking whose histories and knowledge count. Students were challenging the idea that the curriculum they encountered represented universal and neutral knowledge. The education that you've had from kinder to 12th grade and even into your college is not neutral, right? It's not universal knowledge. It's not universal experience. They were asking why some people's histories and the ways of knowing were treated as central and core, while others are marginalized, distorted, or absent, or treated as optional. And then they were asking a question about power, right? Who gets to decide what's taught and how it's taught? That means we're no longer talking about adding some different books and adding diverse people to an existing curriculum. We're asking who has the authority to produce knowledge, define knowledge, teach knowledge, and determine what knowledge is valuable. This distinction is important for this course because it helps us understand why ethnic studies is not only a study of different racial and ethnic groups. The students who fought for these programs were asking something much more substantive and transformative. They were asking universities to recognize whose perspectives, whose knowledge, and who had power in the institution. What counts, what doesn't count. So they were asking universities to recognize whose perspectives that the university was centering, whose knowledge the university was determining as knowledge that counted, and who has power within the walls of the institution. So ethnic studies emerges in part as a response to those questions. And as we move into the Third World Liberation Front and the film On Strike, I want you to keep these three questions in mind. Look at what students actually demanded and ask yourself, were they merely asking for inclusion, or were they trying to change the university themselves? And how successful was it, right? Think about the education that you're receiving today. That question will also help us later when we're thinking about some of the other readings, right? So I'm going to end this here and move to the next lecture for you.